Welcome to the deep dive. If you're looking for a shortcut to really get under the skin of what's shaping modern governance, particularly enforcement culture, then you are definitely in the right place.
We take critical research, sometimes pretty dense stuff, and distill it down. We pull out the essential knowledge for you.
And today we're doing a crucial investigation, really digging into the truths presented by scientific analyst Justin Lake.
That's right. His paper, Outsourcing Ignorance, the Infantilization of Authority. It's a really powerful systemic critique. It looks at how institutions maintain power and, well, order today.
Yeah, and our mission here is to take Lake's arguments, which are, let's be honest, quite dense and focused on structure, and make them immediately accessible. We want to unpack the mechanics of institutional failure.
Specifically where the very systems designed to maintain order, the one that's supposed to keep things stable, actually break down. Or worse, create conflict.
So Lake's central thesis, and it's quite disturbing when you get into it,
It is.
is that modern authority systems, particularly you see this in enforcement bodies, they routinely mistake rigid compliance, just following the rules mechanically, for genuine understanding, for actually getting what's going on.
They end up prioritizing ticking boxes, adhering to a script, overusing real human moral judgment.
And that leads us to the core paradox we need to grapple with today. Lake argues that authority in this kind of system, it isn't earned anymore, not through wisdom or experience or, a proven ability to use discretion.
No, it's simply granted, given to people based on their obedience to the hierarchy.
Right. So we need to examine exactly how the system incentivizes that trade-off, how these procedural scripts actively push moral judgment right out of the picture. Okay, let's dig into the architecture of this problem. Lake kicks off his analysis with this concept he calls outsourcing ignorance. And it sounds academic, but it's more than just, putting new people on the job.
Oh, absolutely. It's framed as a deliberate structural choice, and it has these massive real-world consequences.
So think about the situations where we typically see enforcement personnel deployed. What are we talking about?
Well, highly charged domestic disputes, for one.
Yeah.
Individuals may be experiencing a severe mental health crisis out on the street, or think about protests, the crowd dynamics, how quickly things can change.
Right. These are situations of extreme emotional complexity. They shift constantly. They demand really sharp de-escalation skills, empathy.
And above all, immense situational judgment. You need to read the room, read the person instantly.
Yet, Lake observes, institutions frequently deploy officers who are, and this is his term, underseasoned.
Yeah, often very young, maybe straight out of the academy. They just lack that deep well of life experience, the kind that informs genuine wisdom, discretion.
And this is where Lake says the system's choice becomes, well, toxic.
Exactly, because you're putting this individual who doesn't have that experience base to draw on into a situation that demands the absolute highest level of human discernment.
So the institution isn't really empowering them.
No, Lake argues it's structurally outsourcing its own ignorance. It's basically saying, look, we don't really know how to handle this complex human crisis, so here's a really strict manual.
And you, the inexperienced one, you just apply this manual.
Exactly.
Right.
And that fundamentally shifts how decisions get made.
So the officer isn't guided by a kind of moral calculation. They're not asking, what's the most humane thing here? What's the most just outcome?
No, not primarily. Instead, they're driven by one single, overwhelming priority. The fear of violating protocol, the fear of messing up the procedure.
That fear of getting it wrong, bureaucratically speaking.
That procedural fear, Lake says, is the engine driving the whole system. Every choice becomes risk-averse. It's focused purely on liability. Personal liability, institutional liability.
Which transforms the work itself, doesn't it?
Completely. It shifts from what it should be, an exercise in discernment, which needs flexibility and judgment, into what he calls a performance of compliance.
A performance.
Yeah.
Like acting.
In a way, the officer just has to follow the script, the procedure, perfectly, even if that script leads to an outcome that's obviously unjust or emotionally destructive.
That distinction feels critical. Discernment versus compliance.
It is. Discernment means adapting to the human reality in front of you. Compliance means sticking to the bureaucratic manual no matter what.
And when compliance wins out, the human element is actively penalized, isn't it?
It has to be, because the procedural script inherently treats all human resistance, every emotional response, basically anything that deviates, as a threat. Something to be managed or overcome, not as context to be understood.
So if someone's upset or confused, that's seen as non-compliance.
Often, yes. And if you look at the internal psychology Lake analyzes, you see this clash. The institution's ego, its need to appear infallible, right? To never be wrong, it crashes directly into the young officer's actual inexperience.
Can you describe that collision point for us? What happens when that institutional need for perfection meets individual inexperience in, say, a tense street encounter?
Well, the institution can't admit it got the procedure wrong, or that the procedure itself is flawed. And the young officer, operating mainly out of fear of breaking protocol, is almost guaranteed to make errors in human judgment. It's inevitable.
Okay.
So when those errors happen, when the outcome is clearly unfair or inhumane, the system doesn't reflect. It doubles down. It protects a procedure.
Because criticizing the procedure would mean criticizing the institution itself, the infallible institution.
Exactly. The focus snaps immediately to, did the officer follow steps 1 through 7? Not, was this a wise decision? Was this humane?
So the structure itself guarantees these outcomes that, as you said, satisfy neither justice nor basic humanity.
Yeah.
But it can always claim it was just following the rules.
Precisely. And this leads directly to Lake's really critical conclusion about what modern authority even is.
Okay.
He argues authority is no longer something earned through demonstrated wisdom. Through years of successfully navigating tricky situations, dealing with difficult people.
It's not based on track record.
No. It's simply granted to those who show perfect obedience. Obedience to the procedural hierarchy. And it's maintained not by public trust, but by the officer's own constant internal fear of making a mistake.
A mistake that could expose the system's own flaws.
Yes. And this makes the whole system profoundly rigid, deeply self-serving, and frankly, incredibly dangerous when it actually has to interact with the messy, nuanced reality of social life.
So the safest path for the officer institutionally is always the most rigid one, the least human one.
Often, yes. Because it minimizes the bureaucratic risk, the paperwork, the potential for review, regardless of the emotional wreckage it might leave behind on the street. Right? So if the first part showed us the mechanics, how outsourcing ignorance works, this next section really digs into the social cost, particularly around the idea of respect.
Okay.
Lake draws this really sharp contrast between our cultural expectations about respect and what actually happens in, say, enforcement encounters.
And traditionally, across so many cultures, there's this idea of deference to experience. Respect your elders. It's seen as fundamental, right? A moral bedrock for social order.
It preserves knowledge, maintains stability between generations. That's the cultural baseline we all sort of understand.
But Lake finds that in modern enforcement culture, that's not what's happening.
Not only is it eroded, he argues it's structurally inverted. The system itself seems to actively reward reversing that traditional social order.
Inverted. How so? What specific evidence led him to that pretty strong conclusion?
It's often right there in the visual evidence. Lake points to the disturbing frequency of incidents, and you see these captured on the officer's own body cameras, where clearly young, inexperienced officers are displaying open disrespect.
Towards older civilians.
Yes. Condescension, aggressive posturing, dismissiveness towards older people. And he argues this isn't just, few rogue individuals. It's a pattern that suggests the system tolerates this kind of behavior.
Which seems inevitable if you pit the procedural certainty of youth, that black and white rule following, against the maybe more nuanced wisdom and life experience of age.
That clash is bound to happen. So when it does occur, and let's say the officer's tone or actions are clearly the thing that sparked the conflict.
They were the provocation.
Right. How does the institution, the one that insists it's infallible,
Okay.
how does it react?
Okay, what does it do?
It immediately engages in what Lake calls structural blame reassignment. The initial provocation, the officer's poor conduct, the condescending tone, maybe a direct insult, it just gets erased, wiped from the official narrative.
Vanishes.
And the civilian's reaction, they're a completely natural human reaction, maybe frustration, maybe refusing to be talked down to, maybe just an emotional defense. That reaction is instantly reframed. It's labeled as the actual crime.
So that becomes non-compliance or resisting?
Or disorderly conduct, exactly.
Yeah.
The system essentially tells the civilian, your totally understandable response to being disrespected. That's the real problem here, the disrespect you received. Irrelevant.
That feels like structural gaslighting on a grand scale.
It really does. And Lake argues this reversal isn't just a reactive cover-up. It reflects something deeper, a structural insecurity within the institutions themselves.
Insecurity?
Mm-hmm.
How?
Well, the idea is that institutions project authority through youth because youth is perceived as more likely to obey. Without question, without skepticism, they follow the protocol.
They haven't learned to question the rules yet, maybe.
Perhaps.
Yeah.
So when that uncritical adherence, that procedural mindset, confronts genuine wisdom, maybe the older person saying, hang on, this doesn't make sense, or you don't seem to know what you're doing, the system perceives that wisdom itself as a threat.
Because the wisdom challenges the validity of the sacred procedure.
Precisely. The institution's ego, its need for control, cannot tolerate being challenged by common sense or lived experience.
Yeah.
It demands submission.
So the older citizen's frustration, which might be completely justified.
It's pathologized instantly. It's reframed as aggression,
Mm.
as dangerous non-compliance. And this, Lake says, is the ultimate paradox. Society preaches reverence for age, for the wisdom it supposedly brings. But the enforcement system immediately punishes that wisdom the moment it dares to question bureaucratic control.
And Lake sums this dynamic up. He calls it the one-way test of obedience.
That's a perfect description of the interaction dynamic he observes. Every single encounter effectively becomes this test, where respect is only allowed to flow in one direction, upward, from the citizen to the officer.
So what happens if the officer is disrespectful?
If the officer uses a poor tone, aggressive posture, even delivers a clear personal insult, the system has ready-made excuses. It gets minimized or excused as tactical necessity or maintaining command presence.
It's shielded by this sort of moral camouflage.
Exactly. But the second the civilian reacts like a human being to that insult, maybe they shrug, swear under their breath, take a step back in annoyance, that reaction is instantly criminalized.
That's the dangerous breach.
That's the failure of the one-way test.
Right.
And it justifies immediate escalation in the eyes of the system.
Lake really stresses that the system is built to tolerate the officer's bad behavior while having zero tolerance for the civilian's emotional response to it.
Yes. And that structural reality makes it pretty clear that the primary goal isn't really safety or even order in a meaningful sense. The goal is securing that uncritical deference to procedural authority, however flawed that authority might be in the moment.
And this cycle, it feels like it almost guarantees escalation because the officer is essentially insulated from accountability for their own provocative behavior.
They can bait the civilian.
Right, bait them into a compliance failure that can then be legally justified after the fact.
It creates this mechanism where perhaps the less mature officer, the one who might be more psychologically fragile, can easily provoke a reaction. And they can do it knowing the system will almost certainly back them up, absolve them, and blame the citizen for failing the obedience test.
So this institutional tolerance for disrespect from the uniform isn't just an unfortunate side effect, it's foundational.
Lake argues it's a foundational failure, yes. It enables so much of the dysfunction that follows.
Which leads us straight into how Lake analyzes the language the system uses, the words it uses to kind of paper over these structural problems.
Right.
He makes this incredibly blunt observation. He says departments, under no circumstances, interrogate their own officers' conduct when disrespect is clearly evident on, say, body cam footage.
That refusal to even look at the officer's provocation, that's the system in self-protection mode.
Is it just protection or is it something more?
Lake argues it's more like a necessity for the system to keep functioning as it does. If they actually acknowledge the officer's disrespect, they'd have to acknowledge a moral failure. A failure in leadership, in training, maybe in the whole approach.
Which they can't do because of the institutional ego.
Exactly. So, to avoid that, they retreat into what Lake calls moral camouflage. It's a strategic use of specific language. Language designed to minimize the state's own role in creating or escalating conflict.
And he identifies specific terms, doesn't he? The sort of holy trinity of institutional jargon.
He does. Compliance, procedure, and officer safety.
Those three words, they come up again and again.
They're the shields. And their core function, Lake argues, is always the same. Minimize the state's role, make the state look reactive rather than proactive in the escalation, and rigidly reframe the civilian as the sole source of the problem.
So if a civilian ends up detained or arrested...
It wasn't because the officer might have been unprofessional or escalated things unnecessarily. No, it's because the civilian failed to show proper compliance.
And if force is used, even seemingly excessive force.
It wasn't excessive. It was deemed necessary because of perceived threats to officer safety.
Yeah.
Even if those threats seem minimal to an outside observer.
This creates what Lake calls that consistent linguistic reflex. It's like a broken record. You share the same narrative structure every single time, regardless of the facts.
The script is basically immutable. Whatever the body cam footage might show, the official statement nearly always boils down to. The officer was following procedure in response to a non-compliant individual, thereby ensuring officer safety. Full stop.
It's a narrative designed to shut down further inquiry.
Yes, this linguistic reflex tries to make all the human context, the initial bad tone, the insult, the officer's contribution to the tension, completely irrelevant. It forces anyone looking at it to assess the situation only through the narrow lens of protocol adherence.
Which, conveniently, is exactly how the institution itself defines success. Did the officer follow the steps? Yes. Okay, good interaction.
Right, it's a linguistic trick, really, that makes it almost impossible to have a moral or even a contextual assessment of what actually happened between the human beings involved.
And Lakers uses this really striking analogy to cut through that camouflage. He compares this kind of government behavior to bad parenting.
Yeah, and this analogy is powerful because it applies everyday, common-sense logic to expose the absurdity of the bureaucratic position.
Okay, explain that.
Think about any normal civilian context. A parent dealing with a child, maybe a manager addressing an employee. If the person in authority visibly loses their cool, lashes out aggressively, humiliates the subordinate just because their own authority was questioned or they lost face,
We'd recognize that immediately, wouldn't we?
we'd immediately recognize it as immature, a failure of leadership, basically bad parenting or bad management, an abuse of power, however small.
Okay, that's the civilian logic. So what's the inversion Lake points out when the government or its agent does it?
When an officer escalates a situation, maybe responding to a sarcastic remark with force, or an arrest because their ego felt bruised or their authority was challenged, the system doesn't call it losing your cool.
No.
No, the act is immediately reframed as legitimate compliance enforcement. And Lake says this inversion basically defines modern authority as it often plays out on the street.
So brutality isn't brutality.
It's recast as necessary order. Humiliating the civilian isn't a failure of professionalism.
It's discipline.
Exactly. And the tense, fearful atmosphere that results from this kind of interaction is mislabeled as safety. But Lake argues it's an illusion of safety, one preserved only through the fear of what happens if you don't comply.
And this belief system, this reframing, it allows for what seem like wildly disproportionate uses of force. Lake brings up a specific disturbing example.
He does. He asks, what systemic belief could possibly justify, quote, ripping an elderly woman from her car over a traffic violation?
The gap between the initial offense, a traffic ticket, and that level of physical force is just vast.
It's astronomical. And the officer's actions in a scenario like that, and Lake suggests there are many others, aren't just random acts of aggression. They're a direct result of deep indoctrination.
Indoctrination into what?
Into prioritizing obedience to the procedural script above absolutely everything else. Above common sense, above situational judgment, certainly above basic moral decency. The protocol demands compliance.
And if compliance isn't immediate and total?
Then the full weight of the state's force must be brought to bear to secure it, regardless of how minor the initial reason for the interaction was.
That example really shows the endpoint of this outsourcing ignorance, doesn't it? When the fear of breaking a rule completely outweighs the human cost of enforcing it with extreme prejudice.
And crucially, Lake observes something else. Even when discipline does happen after these high-profile incidents.
Which sometimes it does under public pressure.
Right. But the system itself remains unchanged. The discipline is almost always about managing the optics, fixing the PR problem. It's never framed as addressing the root cause.
They don't say our training is wrong or our philosophy is flawed.
Never. The institution frames the problem narrowly, not as a moral failure inherent in the system's design, but as mere procedural excess. One individual actor steps slightly outside the lines, which paradoxically reinforces the idea that the lines themselves, the procedures, are fundamentally sound. So drilling down further into Lake's analysis, we keep coming back to this central emotional driver, fear.
Right. The officer's fear. The system's fear of liability.
And if officer safety and this constant perception of threat dominate every single interaction, then Lake insists the fundamental failure isn't really about civilians not obeying enough.
It's something deeper.
It's a profound breakdown in communication itself. Fear has essentially replaced dialogue. Procedure has replaced actual understanding.
And you mentioned earlier this isn't just an accident, a byproduct. Lake sees it as part of the design.
He argues it's very much intentional design. He looks closely at the training process, and he highlights how the system seems meticulously engineered to train officers to anticipate threat constantly, at every single turn.
rather than training them to, say, seek context first, or build rapport, or prioritize de-escalation.
Exactly. The dominant training model is threat-centric. Assume the worst first.
Okay, so what happens when you take that threat-centric model and inject it into just a routine social interaction, a traffic stop, a noise complaint?
Lake argues it virtually guarantees escalation. The officer walks into a situation already primed, already operating from a heightened state of defense. They're scanning for danger,
Seeing potential threats everywhere.
seeing every nonverbal cue, every hesitation, maybe even just confusion from the civilian as a potential indicator of lethal threat. The system markets this constant defensive posture as maintaining control, but Lake shows how it just paves the way for conflict that could likely have been avoided.
The officer's fear becomes the kindling.
And the civilians, perfectly normal, maybe slightly confused or annoyed, reaction becomes the spark that ignites it.
Lake makes this really powerful comparison here, one that forces you, the listener, to confront how this mindset gets legitimized structurally. He compares professional protocol to, well, civilian paranoia.
Right. Think about it from the outside. If you, just going about your day, treated every single person you met, the cashier at the store, another parent at school drop-off, your neighbor walking their dog as a potential lethal threat,
If you were constantly suspicious, on edge, ready to use force.
you'd pretty quickly be seen as having a serious problem. Maybe diagnosed with clinical anxiety or paranoia, or honestly, you might get arrested yourself for erratic or threatening behavior.
Okay, that's the civilian standard.
Yet, Lake emphasizes, when officers express this exact same mindset, this claim that every interaction, every person is potentially life-threatening, it's not seen as paranoia.
It's accepted, validated.
Yes, it's institutionalized. It's called protocol. It's called officer safety training. It's normalized.
And that stark contrast leads Lake to ask this really provocative question in this part of the paper.
He asks, if this level of constant fear is truly the standard operating procedure, if officers are effectively trained to feel perpetually under threat, then maybe the uniform, the badge, has stopped being primarily a symbol of courage,
And become instead.
a structural shield for psychological fragility.
Wow, that's a heavy implication.
It's huge. The idea is that the system might be actively protecting, even empowering, individuals who are operating from a place of deep-seated insecurity or fear.
And we're relying on these individuals, conditioned this way, to manage incredibly high-stakes, nuanced, often volatile social conflicts.
Precisely. Lake is pointing directly at the gap between what society expects from law enforcement and what this system, as designed, actually delivers.
We expect discernment, communication, de-escalation.
We expect people capable of managing danger calmly and professionally. But Lake argues, because fear has been so deeply embedded, so institutionalized, and even legitimized as good safety training, the very people we trust to manage danger are instead structurally permitted, even encouraged, to embody it.
Yeah.
They become the agents of escalation themselves.
And the ultimate structural irony, I suppose, is that their fear, the fear that drives the escalation, is then retroactively justified by the very threat anticipation model they were trained in.
It becomes a perfectly closed loop, self-justifying, almost impossible to challenge effectively from within the system's own logic.
So the system works perfectly if the goal is rigid control.
Yes, control through fear and procedure. But it's fundamentally flawed, Lake suggests, if the goal is actual justice or community safety built on trust and understanding. The fear keeps the officer compliant with the protocol.
And the protocol keeps the institution safe from lawsuits and criticism.
Regardless of the collateral damage done to individuals and the community's trust along the way.
So as Lake wraps up his paper, he tackles the big question, right? Why does meaningful change seem so hard? Why do institutions resist so fiercely? We see reforms announced after big incidents. It gives this illusion of progress.
Right, the press conference, the new policy announced.
But Lake insists, even when discipline happens, maybe an officer is fired after excessive force caught on camera. The institution is almost always addressing the optics, not the root cause.
It's absolutely critical for them, he argues, to frame the problem narrowly, as procedural excess, like we talked about, just one person deviating slightly from the otherwise sound rules.
And never as a fundamental moral failure, a flaw in the system's design itself.
Never. Because if they admitted that, they'd be admitting the whole system, the whole philosophy might be broken. And that goes against that core institutional ego, that need for infallibility.
Okay.
So Lake argues, and this is key, that the real intent of the system isn't revealed by its promises to change. It's revealed by its resistance to change.
How so?
He says, when you see that fierce structural pushback against common sense reforms, things like truly independent civilian oversight with teeth, or mandatory enforceable de-escalation standards that prioritize sanctity of life.
When the unions fight back, when departments slow walk implementation.
That resistance, Lake argues, doesn't actually expose ignorance. It's not that they don't know there are better ways to do things.
It exposes.
It exposes the institution's underlying intent. Its intent to preserve the current practice, the aggressive, fear-driven, procedure-first model. Because that model, however flawed ethically, serves the institution's needs for control and liability management.
So the failures aren't really accidents or oversights that just need a bit of tweaking. Lake sees them as features, not bugs.
Essentially, yes. The fight against genuine accountability is the clearest sign of the underlying design. If a system has to be dragged, kicking and screaming, by public pressure or lawsuits into acting more ethically, Lake says that system isn't truly reforming.
It's doing what instead?
It's merely rehearsing. It's performing the outward motions of reform. Maybe they buy some new technology like body cams. Maybe they issue a new, thicker policy manual.
But the core issues remain.
But the underlying scripts, the incentive structures, the culture, the definition of a good officer as one who follows procedure unquestioningly, that remains absolutely rigid. It's just window dressing.
This brings us to a really difficult, but I think essential argument Lake makes near the end. He talks about the nice officer, the good cop.
Right. We all want to believe in the good individual, the officer who does the right thing, who uses empathy and de-escalation. We cling to that hope that individual goodness can somehow redeem the whole structure.
But Lake cautions against relying on that.
He strongly cautions against it. He argues that the presence of a genuinely decent, empathetic officer, and of course they exist, doesn't actually alter the system in any meaningful way. It doesn't redeem a structure that fundamentally rewards aggression and punishes natural human responses.
So relying on individual goodness is almost a distraction.
It can be a distraction from the necessary harder work of critiquing and changing the structure itself.
But why is that individual nice officer ultimately irrelevant to the systemic problem if they're genuinely doing good work?
Because, Lick explains, the underlying procedures remain intact. Those rules, those scripts, that emphasis on compliance and control, they're still there.
Okay.
And those same procedures still allow the less disciplined officer, the disrespectful one, the one operating out of fear or fragility, to bait civilians with near total impunity.
Because the system will protect them if they can frame it as a compliance issue.
Exactly. The nice officer's good behavior becomes an anomaly, easily ignored or dismissed by the system's inertia. But the officer who baits someone, they know that the moral camouflage compliance, procedure, officer safety will almost certainly kick in to protect them if they successfully manufacture a non-compliance failure from the civilian.
So the structural incentives always ultimately favor the pathway of escalation and rigid control, not the path of connection or understanding.
Precisely. Lake really drives home this point. The occasional good example, the officer who uses genuine discernment and respect, they don't actually correct the rule. They just throw the massive gap between stated policy and entrenched, fear-driven practice into sharper relief.
So until the structure itself changes what it rewards, what it punishes.
Until it starts rewarding wisdom and de-escalation as much as, or more than, it rewards blind obedience and aggression, the fundamental problem Lake identifies remains untouched. The design is the issue. And that design, he concludes, currently functions by effectively infantilizing authority, granting power without demanding wisdom. #outro. So, to really boil down the essential truths we've pulled from Justin Lake's analysis today, maybe you remember these key takeaways. First, modern authority, particularly in enforcement, often isn't earned wisdom, but rather a performance of compliance driven by institutionalized fear.
Okay.
Second, the system structurally inverts traditional notions of respect. It often ends up punishing civilian wisdom or even just natural frustration, especially when that challenges bureaucratic control.
Got it.
Third, that specific language compliance, procedures safety, functions as a kind of moral camouflage. It shields the institution from having to acknowledge its own role when things escalate.
Right, deflection.
And finally, that resistance you see to real, meaningful reform. Lake argues that's not usually a sign of ignorance. It's a clear signal revealing a deliberate, protective design intended to maintain the status quo.
This deep dive into Lake's work, it really pushes us to look past just the surface, doesn't it? Beyond the optics of single incidents. We have to examine the fear, the perverse incentives that are baked into the structure of the whole system.
What is the real human cost, the societal cost, of prioritizing that kind of mechanical obedience over genuine wisdom, over context, over understanding.
Yeah. And that leads us perfectly into our final thought for you, the listener, to maybe mull over.
If Lake is right, if the very definition of institutional protocol seems to require constant validated fear to function properly, what kind of fundamental structural changes would actually be needed? We're talking beyond just tweaking procedures.
Changes maybe to training philosophies, to funding priorities, perhaps even to the legal concept of liability itself. What would it take to truly shift the institutional focus away from perpetually anticipating threat and towards genuinely seeking context, wisdom, and understanding in every single human interaction they undertake? What's the true cost of continuing to prioritize obedience over wisdom?